Joe Rogan is without question one of the most famous men on the planet. Many of his fans either know him for his comedy or his podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience. But for us, he's always going to be the iconic voice of the UFC broadcast team, with him being the longest serving member of the current panel. There are 10 deleted moments Joe Rogan doesn't want fans to see. A scheduling issue. If there are 3 names that you can all but guarantee to see at major UFC pay-per-view in the US, they are the company president Dana White, the voice of the Octagon Bruce Buffer, and the veteran commentator that is Joe Rogan. However, at UFC 271, something strange happened. Joe had been in the news quite frequently that week after being accused of spreading misinformation about COVID-19, something that caused several legendary musicians such as Neil Young and Joni Mitchell to pull their back catalog from the streaming service. Joe then revealed that he'd be unable to commentate at the UFC event because of a scheduling conflict. A strange coincidence. Well, at that time, we may have thought so, but then Dana White decided to make it clear that there was no scheduling conflict and Joe could have very easily worked at the event if he'd chosen to. You want to talk about throwing the man under the bus? Come on, Uncle Dana.
There's no conflict of schedule. Joe Rogan didn't work tonight. Joe Rogan could have worked tonight. Rogan.
Did he elect not to?
Yeah, Joe Rogan had, I don't know what Joe Rogan had to do. You guys will have to ask Joe Rogan, but there was no Joe couldn't work or anything like that.
A what? Sometimes Joe's penchant for colorful language gets him in trouble, and even more often he tends to get his role as a podcast host and live fight commentator mixed up, as he often spends more time joking around on the broadcast than he does focusing on the action in the cage. However, for our money, this slip-up was just about as hilarious as a moment as he's ever had on the mic. After a fighter had suffered a pretty hideous cut mid-fight, Rogan, being the poet that he is, decided to compare it to the most random thing possible. Seriously, we could take 1,000 attempts at describing that cut and never end up where Joe did. An instantly iconic commentary line, and one that will have its place in Rogan compilations for years to come. We'll just leave it at that. Joe, you are truly one of a kind. My mistake. Look, we're just as surprised as everyone else when Jan Blachowicz managed to upset the odds in a major way and storm through the 205-pound division to win UFC gold. But we also reckon that one look at the dude would be enough to understand that he's among the bigger light heavyweights on the roster. So when Joe Rogan spoke to Jan about his massive victory over Israel Adesanya and started giving him props for how he managed to pack on the pounds as a former middleweight himself, we were all left scratching our heads. Blachowicz is certainly more likely to make a run at heavyweight than he does ever hitting the 185-pound mark. So when Joe started to praise him, Blachowicz was very clearly confused, but to his credit, he did a good job at letting Rogan down without making him look bad. Jan's unlikely late career resurgence had made a huge hit with the fans, but as UFC color commentator Joe really should have done his homework on this one, crossing a line. And when you have hours upon hours of podcast footage and thousands of tweets for fans to dig into, out of nowhere, you could well and find yourself in hot water for something that was said years ago. And this exact thing happened to Joe Rogan when it emerged that he had used the N-word on several different occasions in his older episodes of the podcast. All of a sudden, Rogan's name was all over the mainstream news, with many previous fans criticizing him heavily for his carelessness and lack of respect. Joe himself was quick to make an apology, claiming that the clips did not tell the full story and that he since had learned on a deeper level of understanding when it comes to his language and the issues at hand. After well over 1,000 episodes of Joe Rogan Experience podcast, chances are this won't be the last old comment that comes back to bite the famed comedian and host. Many of Joe's colleagues and former UFC fighters came to his defense, including Israel Adesanya, whose backing caused Rogan to tear up. Sure, a lesson was learned, but we're guessing that this whole saga was something Joe would have preferred not to have dealt with so publicly.
Look, I can't go back in time and change what I've said. I wish I could. Obviously, that's not possible. But I do hope that this can be a teachable moment for anybody that doesn't realize how offensive that word can be coming out of a white person's mouth, in context or out of context.
A future champ? Nurmagomedov is a pretty tough name to say when you're first getting the hang of it. But when a fighter as famous and totally unavoidable as Khabib Nurmagomedov bursts into the scene saying his surname kind of stops being a problem. However, Joe Rogan ran into some very real trouble when he was attempting to give the Octagon send-off to Khabib's cousin Umar, who had just submitted Brian Keller in the opening round. Let's be real here, Rogan made an absolute mess of Umar's surname, and as you might expect, the moment went viral pretty quickly. Even Khabib saw the funny side of it, posting to his official Instagram to tell Joe that he would be wise to remember his cousin's name in the future. Thanks for certain it's that he has some pretty huge boots to fill. Remember, if you're enjoying our content and want to see more, be sure to leave a like before subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on any of our weekly uploads. Bad timing. Sometimes having a live microphone in front of your face has the potential to do some very real damage, and while things could have been a lot worse in the occasion, we still have to include it. The year was 2017 and the United States were left stunned after gunmen opened fire at a music festival at Las Vegas, Nevada, killing 60 people in a truly tragic event. Naturally, the UFC wanted to pay tribute to those who had died or been injured, and during the next UFC event, they ran a video piece to commemorate the victims. The problem? Well, as this piece was running, someone forgot to turn off Joe Rogan's mic, and you can very clearly hear him asking if he had the time to run off for a piss in the middle of the video package. Sure, this wasn't Joe's fault at all, but we'd be willing to bet that he wasn't too thrilled to find out that his seemingly innocent request had been heard by millions of viewers. On another day, it would have been a lighthearted slip-up, but the timing was just awful. The Fox debut. Getting a deal done with major broadcaster like Fox was a hell of an achievement for Dana White and the UFC. Naturally, they wanted to make a major splash with their debut on the network, so Dana brought together many of the most recognizable faces in the sport for promotional press conference. Joe Rogan was of course tasked with giving each fighter's introduction, but in one of the most hilariously unfortunate moments you'll ever see, his delivery was totally messed up by a Fox team who were behind the camera. Chuck Liddell and Rashad Evans were introduced to the public with an issue, but everyone was left on the verge of an all-out laughter when Joe mixed up George St. Pierre and Frankie Edgar. Whether it was his own fault or the production crew's, the resulting sequence was just about as awkward as a moment as you can imagine. A silence quickly fell over the studio. Even GSP and Edgar were forced to crack a smile about the whole thing. Not a great start for UFC on Fox, but trust us, things eventually got a whole lot better. Early setback. Teenage fight stories are rarely ones that adults are proud of, and when it comes to martial artists, stories like this are often the reason that they decide to train in the first place. Joe Rogan, as you might expect, is no exception. Long before he had secured black belts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in both gi and no gi, as well as Taekwondo, he was far less threatening of a teenager growing up like most other kids his age. During this time, he got into a fight, if you could even call it that, with a bigger teenager.
I had the last one I got in, I lost, and the guy didn't even hurt me. He got me in a headlock. Like, I didn't even know we were gonna fight. I was like, why is this guy staring at me like this? Like, he got in my face, he grabbed me in a headlock and he threw me to the ground. And he got on top of me in the bathroom, the boys' room. And he went like that, he was gonna punch me, and then he laughed. He was like, nah, I don't even have to. And he just let me up, and it was humiliating. Yeah. It was humiliating.
This proved to be the last straw for Rogan, and from there onwards, his life was well and truly taken over by martial arts. Victor who? You only get one chance to make a first impression, and for Joe Rogan, his earliest days in the UFC saw him run into at least a few problems. In 1997, Rogan made his first appearance on the UFC broadcast team, filling the role of a post-fight interviewer. Appearing on that card was a future Hall of Famer Vitor Belfort, a man who, despite his young age, was already making some serious waves as heavyweight. At just 19 years old, Belfort was already seen as one of the most well-rounded fighters in the game, a dual threat of boxing and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu who was expected to take the fight game by storm over the coming years. So when Joe took to the octagon after Belfort's victory to give him his chance to speak to the world, he repeatedly called him Victor instead of Vitor. Which, although not the biggest mistake in the world, was something that Joe probably should have gotten right, because, you know, it was his first day and all. A 10-8 round. Joe was challenged to a wrestling match by a pretty courageous member of the audience. Going along with it, Rogan asked the fan what he would do if he was able to force the tap out of him, and to everyone's surprise, the dude told Joe that he'd black out before he even tapped out, bitch, causing a huge eruption of laughs from those present. As a comedian, Joe is no doubt used to hecklers wherever he goes. Kudos to you, random audience member.
Can I wrestle Joe Rogan, and if I win, you come to Sweden?
Huh? Sure, get up here. What happens when I win?
If you beat me in a stare down, if you win.
What happens if you tap? That's all I want to know. What do I get?
I black out before I tap out, bitch.
And that'll just about do it for today's video, but what's your own personal favorite Joe Rogan moment over the years? Again, if you enjoyed today's video and want to see more, be sure to leave a like and comment before subscribing to the channel so you can stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. Thank you for watching.